The Central African Republic, or CAR, suffers from disastrous violence. The origins of the current crisis have long roots, but most news reports draw the conclusion that a North-South or Muslim-Christian divide underlies the problems. This misses the fact that numerous actors create the violence for material gain. It's helpful to look at the geographic diversity of the country to understand the varied sources and targets of the violence. CAR lies, in fact, in the center of Africa. It borders Sudan, South Sudan, Congo, Congo-Brazzaville, Cameroon, and Chad. In the southeast are rainforests, the far north sub-Saharan, and much of the rest of the country is savanna. What is now CAR was part of French Equatorial Africa in the 19th century. The eastern part of the territory was ruled by sultans until Mohammed as-Sanusi was assassinated in 1913. Both the sultans and French ruled with tremendous violence. A look at where the people who have ruled CAR since independence is helpful. Boganda drove the fight for independence. He would have been first president but died in a plane crash, so Dako became the first president. He was overthrown by Bokassa, who declared himself first president for life and then in 1977, emperor. But just a couple of years after declaring himself emperor, the French got rid of Bokassa and brought back Dako. Those early leaders had similar origins in the southwest of the country, so the power and the wealth accumulated in that area. Now, since 1981, democratic elections have been held regularly. Sometimes they weren't terribly fair. There have been some power changes by coup, but presidents from other regions have been elected or installed. Jodia was a leader of a rebel alliance that overthrew Bouzizi. Samba Panza was elected as a peace bringer, and she stepped down voluntarily to set an example. Of course, she was only in for 2 years, and she couldn't overcome greed and the lust for power, so her example did not stick. The various rulers of CAR, as I said, come from certain regions and favored those places. Now, the first 3 were all from the Lobai in the southwest. Kalingbo was from Bangui, which is the notional capital of the country, but had roots in Yakoma. Then Patase was elected as the very first northerner, creating a lot of political strife. I divided the country into 7 general regions that differ from each other. Note that each of these could easily be further subdivided. The central south is really just Bangui, the capital and largest, most diverse city. The southwest is largely rainforest with distinctive groups such as the Baka forest people and with rare populations of forest elephants and lowland gorillas. The northwest is well populated, mostly Gabaya, but did have a substantial Muslim population in close contact with Cameroon and Chad. The north is remote with a large Muslim population, but is diverse due to people being settled there by slave raiders. The north is rich in fauna with large national parks that have been decimated by the conflict. The northeast and east are sparsely populated, and they're remote and roadless, and has little contact as a result with the rest of the country. The central east contains the large city of Bangassou, but also small mining towns that have been the center of conflict. The central region has the city of Kagabandoro, another hard-hit area. One of the 2 paved roads in the country, yes, there are only 2 paved roads in the country, and one of them runs between Sibut and Bangui. The other is between Mumbaiki and Bangui. Bokassa built that road, and attacks on Bangui have brought violence along that route. Now, violence has not spared any part of the country. This slide is a violence mapping, and all of the pink or red dots indicate concentrations of violence. Where you don't see violence indicated, it's because those areas are not populated. Bangui is the focus of most reports about the disaster in CAR. This is because the government is seated there, but really only controls parts of Bangui. Because people who don't like each other live close together in the urban area, they find it easy to attack each other and often do. Bangui has been the prize for armed militias trying to control the government. The Central African Armed Forces, FACA, contribute the most to the violence, and since 2020, the Russian Wagner Group provides security for the Touadera government with much more effective, but really atrocious means. The militias and other entities who attack Bangui from the outside arise from almost every region. The Coalition of Patriots for Change, CPC, is a broad, weekly linked assembly of 6 rebel groups, Muslim and non-Muslim, with different origins. And the CPC has been responsible for much of the violence in Bangui over the past several years. The usual story is that the conflict is between the Seleka, a coalition of Muslims from northern CAR, Chad, and Sudan, versus anti-Balaka. The term anti-Balaka was adopted by largely illiterate fighters who used gree-gree charms as protection against Kalashnikov weapons. In fact, Seleka was only briefly and weakly unified. You can see that in the large blue, darker blue spot in the diagram. It dissolved into multiple ex-Seleka militias that further subdivided, often fighting against each other. Coalitions like the CPC include both ex-Seleka and ex-anti-Balaka groups. All of these groups consisted of individuals who are more interested in their own gains than in any principles or other aims. In the Southwest, the anti-Balaka is an extremely broad group of armed people whose supposed aims involve fighting the Seleka, even though they have little presence there, and Muslims in general. They've attacked cattle herders who move their animals across long distances, often having originated in West Africa. Now, these people are not at all unified, but are also opportunistic and attack each other repeatedly, both to gain power and because of ethnic distrust. They're among the several groupings of armed cadres who poach in the parks and decimate the populations of forest elephants and other endangered species. You can note from the dark blue in map 2 the presence of the Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA, in the east. The anti-Balaka emerged in the northwest, but spread to the rest of the country other than the north and east. The northern border of northwest has a potent mix of ex-Seleka and ex-Balaka elements. However, this well-populated region has many militias that aren't in those camps, and these people take advantage of the proximity to Cameroon and Cameroon's relative riches. Much of the strife in this region can nonetheless be framed in terms of Muslim, Christian, or native foreign labels. Ethnic cleansing has eliminated Muslim presence from many towns that formerly had Muslim populations. Massive Muslim immigration from CAR to Cameroon and Chad may affect societal norms for many decades, as Muslims have traditionally played somewhat distinct and important roles in the economy by providing most non-agricultural market goods. Northern CAR has always been remote from Bangui. Sanusi established his sultanate, Dar al-Kuti, in the late 19th century in what is now Delhi, and has kept the French at bay until they assassinated him in 1913. During much of the past decade, rebels ruled the area with mixed effects. Education was improved under rebel governance, although probably not sustainably because of a low baseline. Mining, cattle herding, and poaching in rural areas became hotly contested among varying groups, however, to the detriment of the unarmed populace. Security is a very mixed bag. In 2020, a Gula faction from Barrow of the rebel FPRC, that's the ex-Seleka coalition, attacked people in Delhi several times, killing many civilians. The FPRC Runga faction from Delhi actively failed to protect civilians, so the town was abandoned by 16,000 of its 20,000 residents. So the population dropped by over 75% because of violence. In May 2020, FACA entered Delhi and dispatched the rebels. This replaced non-state violence with state violence committed by FACA and the Wagner Group. The map you're looking at now shows the distribution of some of the militias. It also outlines the few roads along which Muslim Sudanese traders, especially in cattle, make their way south to sell their wares. The routes used to go all the way to Bangui. You can see those routes with the reddish circles, and now they stop well north of Bangui because of roadblocks by the anti-Balaka type groups. Even farther north, where they're still able to pass the roads, the roadblocks are very numerous, and traders have to bribe armed men at most of the roadblocks. So the northeast and east of CAR were depopulated by Senussi and by the presence of tsetse flies that made it difficult to keep domestic animals. In the southern portion, however, the rivers supported cities that are at least as remote from Bangui as the north. This pole of inaccessibility facilitates predation by armed elements. The most notorious of these is the LRA that we mentioned before, based in Uganda and South Sudan, who fled into eastern CAR. Both the US and Uganda attempted to capture the LRA there, quite unsuccessfully, just because it was so remote. Fortunately, the LRA does seem to be dwindling and losing power. The central east of CAR didn't seem important until recently, but it has a lot of resources, especially diamonds, and that escalates corruption and violence. Much of the fighting now centers on this region. Almost all of the maps delineating activities of the many actors intersect around Bria, a primary center of diamond mining. Tellingly, the Wagner Group has concentrated on Central African gold and diamonds to facilitate its mercenary work. Native rebel groups aim to preserve their access to these resources by attacking the Russians and their allies, but in the process, civilians are killed and displaced. Central CAR borders the other regions except for the Far East and suffers from the spillover. Kaga-Bandaro is a relatively large city with traditionally diverse populations. It's seen some of the worst episodes of murders. Closer to Bangui, the movements of militias have brought tremendous violence. The militias primarily fight among themselves when they aren't preying on civilians, so it seems like the violence there just never stops. Many battles are fought over resources, not only diamonds and gold, but also animals and agricultural products. Nearly 1 million refugees from CAR live in neighboring countries. Internally displaced persons number 500,000. These are people fleeing from violence, and this map suggests where such violence originates. These are not places where armies battle, but instead comprise local actors terrorizing their neighbors or militias, including the CAR army or the Wagner Group, battling with each other. Back when CAR was a dictatorship, the only guns were in the hands of the emperor, and the country was peaceful and reasonably safe. Once it became a democracy, guns proliferated, and the country became a violent mess that somehow keeps getting worse as guns multiply. It's difficult to determine how this could get better, because even if CAR were to revert to dictatorship, it would be very difficult to restore peace in light of the sheer volume of guns in the country. Thank you for taking some time to learn about the roots of violence and the regional bases of conflict in CAR. As I show the bibliography slides, we'll play some kunde music, which is traditional harp, recorded back during when CAR was peaceful in the 70s.